After returning to her abandoned childhood home at 74, an elderly woman discovers something hidden beneath the old floorboards, something that completely changes everything she believed about her family for over 60 years. What she uncovers inside that forgotten house will lead her to a shocking truth, a lost past, and a second chance she never thought possible. Subscribe for more emotional and inspiring stories, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Margaret Collins was 74 when she finally returned to the house everyone in Blackwater Cove believed was cursed. The old seaside home stood alone at the edge of the cliffs along the coast of Maine, battered by decades of storms and silence. Its pale blue paint had long since peeled away, exposing weathered wood beneath. Most people in town avoided even looking at it. But Margaret couldn't. Not after 62 years. As a child, she had once run through those narrow hallways laughing beside her mother, Evelyn, a gentle pianist with tired eyes and secrets she never explained. Then, one winter night, Evelyn vanished without warning, leaving behind nothing but rumors and heartbreak. The town said she abandoned her family. Margaret's father claimed she ran away, and for most of her life, Margaret believed him. Now, after her husband's death and a lonely retirement in Boston, Margaret received a final notice from the county the house would be demolished within 30 days unless someone claimed it. So she came back, not to save the house, but to bury the memories inside it once and for all. Yet the moment she stepped through the front door, the floorboards creaked beneath her feet, and something about the sound made her stop cold, because deep inside that abandoned house, something was still waiting for her. The first night inside the house felt wrong. Not dangerous. Not haunted. Just awake. Margaret Collins sat alone at the tiny kitchen table, wrapped in her late husband's wool cardigan, while rain hammered against the windows overlooking the Atlantic. A single lamp cast weak golden light across the room, barely pushing back the darkness gathering in the corners. The electricity flickered every few minutes. The house groaned constantly. Wood shifting, pipes rattling, wind scraping branches across the roof. An old house settling, she told herself. Nothing more. Yet sometime after midnight, Margaret heard something that made her freeze completely. Footsteps. Slow, uneven. Directly above her. Her eyes lifted toward the ceiling. Creak. 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 The sound moved carefully across the second floor like someone pacing in circles. Margaret's pulse quickened. No, she whispered under her breath. It's just the storm. But deep down, she knew the difference between an old house making noise and footsteps. These had weight, pattern, intention. She pushed herself up from the chair, gripping the edge of the table for balance as another creak echoed overhead. For a brief moment, she considered ignoring it. At 74 years old, common sense should have told her to stay downstairs until morning. But something stronger than fear pulled at her. Curiosity. Or maybe memory. Margaret grabbed the flashlight resting beside the sink and slowly made her way toward the staircase. Every step groaned beneath her weight as she climbed higher. The smell upstairs was different, older somehow, filled with damp wood, dust, and the faint scent of lavender buried beneath decades of decay. Her mother's scent. Margaret stopped halfway up the stairs, her chest tightening unexpectedly. She hadn't thought about that perfume in years. The flashlight trembled slightly in her hand. At the top of the stairs, darkness swallowed the hallway whole. The wallpaper peeled from the walls in curling strips, and moonlight slipped weakly through cracked windows at the far end. Then, creak! Directly behind her. Margaret spun around so quickly her shoulder slammed into the wall. Nothing. The hallway was empty. Her breathing turned shallow. "This is ridiculous," she muttered nervously. Still, she kept walking. At the end of the hallway sat the one room she had avoided since arriving. Her mother's bedroom. The door stood partially open. Margaret stared at it for a long moment, unease twisting deep in her stomach. As a child, she had spent countless evenings sitting on the edge of that bed while Evelyn played soft piano melodies beside the window. Then one night, she disappeared. No goodbye. No explanation. Only silence. Margaret stepped closer and slowly pushed the door open. The hinges let out a long, aching whine. Dust covered everything inside. White sheets draped over old furniture like ghosts frozen in time. Rain tapped softly against the window overlooking the cliffs. And then Margaret saw it, near the center of the room. A section of the wooden floor looked different. She frowned. The boards were slightly newer than the others. Not modern, but replaced. Poorly. Margaret crouched slowly, aiming the flashlight downward. Tiny scratches surrounded the edges of the planks, as if someone had pried them open years ago and hurriedly nailed them back into place. Her heartbeat began to pound harder. What is this? The house suddenly felt colder. She reached out carefully, pressing her fingers against the wood. Loose, very loose. Almost immediately, another memory surfaced, one she hadn't thought about in decades. She was 12 years old again, standing in this exact room, watching her mother kneel on the floor late at night while whispering nervously, "You must never tell your father about this place. Do you understand me?" Margaret's breath caught violently in her throat. The memory hit her so suddenly she nearly lost balance. She had forgotten. No, not forgotten. Buried, just like whatever was hidden beneath those boards. Rain thundered harder outside now, shaking the windows as panic and curiosity collided inside her chest. Margaret stood abruptly and searched the room until she found an old fireplace poker leaning beside the wall. She returned to the loose boards, knelt down, and slid the metal tip carefully into the crack. The wood resisted at first. Then, crack! One nail snapped free. Margaret froze, listening. The entire house seemed silent now. Watching, waiting. With trembling hands, she pulled harder. Another board lifted. Dust exploded into the air, making her cough violently as decades of trapped darkness opened beneath her. And there, hidden below the floorboards, was the corner of a black leather suitcase. Margaret stared down at it, unable to breathe. The leather looked aged but perfectly preserved, wrapped tightly in thick plastic as if someone had desperately tried to protect it from time itself. Her pulse thundered in her ears. "No," she whispered. Slowly, carefully, she pulled the suitcase upward. It was heavier than she expected. Far heavier. As she dragged it fully into the room, something metallic inside shifted with a dull clunk. Margaret's hands began shaking uncontrollably. Because at that exact moment, she realized something terrifying. Her mother never ran away. She had been planning something. And whatever truth had been hidden beneath these floorboards for over 60 years was about to change everything Margaret believed about her family forever. Margaret stared at the suitcase for nearly a full minute before touching it again. Rain pounded violently against the windows now, and thunder rolled across the cliffs outside Blackwater Cove like distant cannon fire. The weak flashlight beam trembled across the worn black leather resting on the dusty bedroom floor. It looked old. Very old, but not abandoned. Someone had wrapped it carefully in thick plastic to protect it from moisture. Every detail felt deliberate, planned. Margaret swallowed hard. Her pulse hammered painfully in her chest as she slowly unfastened the brittle leather straps. Click. The sound echoed unnaturally loud inside the silent room. For one terrifying moment, she hesitated, because deep down, she already knew this suitcase contained more than memories. It contained answers, and answers had a way of destroying lives. Finally, Margaret lifted the lid. The smell hit her first. Old paper, metal, cigarette smoke trapped inside fabric for decades. Inside the suitcase were dozens of neatly bundled envelopes tied together with faded blue ribbon. Beneath them sat stacks of cash wrapped in newspaper from 1971. Old photographs, official-looking documents, and underneath everything else, a small silver revolver. Margaret recoiled instantly. Oh my God. Her breath caught in her throat as the flashlight beam reflected off the cold metal. The gun looked worn but clean, carefully maintained before being hidden away. Hands trembling violently now, Margaret reached for the photographs instead. One by one, she spread them across the floorboards, and her entire understanding of her family began to crack apart. The first photo showed her mother standing beside two unfamiliar men near the harbor docks. The second showed crates being unloaded from a fishing boat late at night. The third, Margaret froze completely. Her father, much younger, angrier, holding a duffel bag stuffed with cash. "No," she whispered weakly. Her stomach twisted painfully. The father she remembered had been strict, cold, unpredictable, but never criminal. Never this. Margaret's breathing became shallow as she dug deeper into the suitcase, pulling out folded newspaper clippings with bold headlines. "Local smuggling ring under investigation. Coast Guard searches main harbor. Witness disappears before federal hearing." The dates all matched the exact year her mother vanished. A horrible realization began forming slowly inside her mind. Her mother didn't disappear randomly. Something happened. Something dangerous. Then Margaret noticed the journal. A faded dark green notebook tucked carefully beneath the money bundles. Her mother's handwriting covered the front. "Evelyn Collins, private." Margaret's fingers shook so badly she nearly dropped it. For a moment, she couldn't open it. Because suddenly, after 62 years of confusion, anger, and grief, the truth was sitting directly in front of her, and she wasn't sure she was ready to survive it. Thunder exploded outside, rattling the entire house. Margaret opened the journal. The first pages were ordinary enough daily notes, shopping lists, piano lessons, weather observations. Then the tone changed. April 3rd, 1971. "Thomas is getting worse. He comes home angry every night. He thinks I don't know what happens at the harbor, but I hear the phone calls, I see the money." Margaret's chest tightened. Thomas, her father. She turned the page quickly. April 18th, 1971. "I told him I want out. He grabbed my arm so hard it bruised. He said if I ever spoke to the police, Margaret would pay for it." Margaret stopped breathing. Memories she had buried for decades suddenly rushed back in fragments. Her mother crying behind locked doors. Broken dishes. Her father screaming downstairs late at night. The fear. Dear God. She had spent her entire life remembering him as difficult, not dangerous. Margaret kept reading. May 2nd, 1971. "If anything happens to me, the evidence is under the floorboards. I pray Margaret never finds it, unless she absolutely must know the truth." Tears blurred Margaret's vision. Her hands covered her mouth as years of lies collapsed inside her all at once. Her mother never abandoned her. She was trying to protect her. Then Margaret reached the final written page, and everything changed. May 11th, 1971. "Tonight is my only chance to leave. A federal agent agreed to help me disappear before Thomas finds out I spoke to investigators. If I stay, he will kill me. I know he will. But I cannot take Margaret with me. He watches her too closely. If I try, he'll stop us both. So I must make the hardest choice a mother can make. Leave my daughter behind so she can live." Margaret let out a broken gasp. No. Tears spilled freely down her face now. For 62 years, she had hated her mother. Blamed her? Believed she walked away willingly? And all this time, Evelyn Collins had sacrificed everything to keep her daughter alive. Margaret pressed the journal tightly against her chest as sobs overtook her body. But then, a sudden sound downstairs made her freeze. The front door slammed shut. Hard. Margaret's head snapped toward the hallway. Her blood turned ice cold. She wasn't alone anymore. Slow, heavy footsteps echoed from the first floor beneath her. One step at a time. Deliberate. Coming closer. Margaret wiped her tears quickly, panic exploding through her chest as another floorboard creaked below. Then, a man's voice drifted upward from the darkness downstairs. Low, aged, but unmistakably familiar. "You finally found it." Margaret's entire body went numb, because she recognized that voice immediately. It belonged to someone who was supposed to be dead. Margaret couldn't move. Every muscle in her body locked as the voice drifted upward from the darkness below. "You finally found it." The flashlight nearly slipped from her trembling fingers. Impossible. Her father had been dead for 15 years. She attended the funeral herself. She remembered the rain, The coffin, the closed casket lowered into the frozen ground beside St. Andrew's Church. So how? Another floorboard creaked downstairs. Slow. Heavy. Real? Margaret's heartbeat thundered painfully in her chest as she stood from the floor, clutching her mother's journal tightly against her sweater. "Who's there?" she called weakly. Silence answered first. Then, "You sound just like your mother." The voice was older now, rougher, worn down by age and regret, but unmistakable. Thomas Collins, Margaret's father. Her knees nearly gave out beneath her. "No," she whispered. "No, that's not possible." Fear surged through her body, but beneath the fear came something even stronger. Anger. 62 years of confusion, 62 years of lies, 62 years spent hating the wrong person. Margaret grabbed the revolver from the suitcase before she could think twice. Her hands shook violently as she stepped into the dark hallway. The old staircase groaned beneath every careful step downward. Shadows stretched across the walls as lightning flashed outside the windows. And there, standing beside the kitchen table, was an old man in a dark wool coat. Thin, gray-haired, weathered by time, but undeniably him. Thomas Collins slowly removed his hat as Margaret reached the bottom step. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Margaret stared at the man she buried 15 years ago, the man who destroyed her mother's life, the man she had mourned despite everything. "You're dead," she said finally, her voice barely audible. Thomas gave a tired nod. "That's what everyone believes." Margaret tightened her grip on the gun instinctively. "You lied to me." His eyes lowered briefly. "Yes." The simplicity of the answer enraged her more than denial would have. "You let me think she abandoned us," Margaret snapped suddenly. "All those years you let me hate her." Pain flickered across Thomas's face, but not surprise, as if he had expected this moment for decades. "I know," he said quietly. Margaret's breathing became sharp and uneven. "No," she whispered. "You don't get to say that like it means nothing." Lightning exploded outside, flooding the kitchen with white light for half a second before darkness swallowed the room again. Thomas looked older than she remembered. Not frightening anymore. Not powerful. Just tired. "I never meant for you to find that journal," he admitted softly. Margaret laughed bitterly through tears. "Well, that's unfortunate for you." Silence stretched painfully between them. Then Thomas slowly reached into his coat pocket. Margaret instantly raised the revolver. "Don't move." "I'm not reaching for a weapon," he said calmly. Slowly, carefully, he removed an old photograph and placed it gently on the table. Margaret stared at it. Her mother, alive, older, standing in front of a small cafe somewhere she didn't recognize. The date written on the back made Margaret's breath stop. 3 years ago. "She's alive," Margaret whispered. Thomas nodded once. The room tilted around her. After decades of grief, after a lifetime believing her mother was either dead or lost forever, she was alive. Margaret's legs weakened as she grabbed the edge of the chair beside her. "Why?" she asked shakily. "Why would you hide this from me?" Thomas closed his eyes briefly before answering. "Because if people knew Evelyn was alive, they would start asking questions about what happened back then." Margaret stared at him in disbelief. "So this was about protecting yourself?" "No," he said immediately. "For a long time, maybe, but not anymore." Margaret's eyes hardened. "Then explain it to me." Thomas looked toward the storm outside the window, as though searching for words buried deeper than pride would normally allow. "When your mother spoke to federal agents, the men I worked for found out," he said quietly. "They threatened to kill both of you." Margaret's chest tightened. "I thought if she disappeared, they'd stop looking." "And did they?" Thomas nodded slowly. "For a while." Margaret's voice shook with rage. "You still terrified her. You still made her run." His silence confirmed everything. Tears burned Margaret's eyes again. "You ruined our lives." Thomas swallowed hard. "Yes," he whispered. For the first time in her life, Margaret saw something in her father she never thought possible. Not anger, not control. Regret. Real regret. I drank because I hated myself, he admitted quietly. Every day after she left. Margaret looked at him coldly. That doesn't fix anything. I know. Another long silence filled the kitchen. Then Thomas said the one thing Margaret never expected to hear. She wanted to come back for you. Margaret froze. What? Thomas reached slowly into his coat again and removed a second envelope. Old, yellowed, unopened. She sent letters, he said, for years. Margaret's hands trembled as she took the envelope. Her name was written across the front in elegant handwriting she recognized instantly. Margaret, love always, Mom. A sob caught painfully in her throat. You kept these from me, she whispered. Thomas nodded once, unable to meet her eyes. Because I was selfish. Margaret stared at the letters in disbelief. Her entire life, every memory, every resentment, had been built on lies. But suddenly, something shifted inside her. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Something deeper. Understanding. For the first time, Margaret realized her life had never been divided into good people and bad people. Only broken people. People who loved badly. People who feared badly. People who destroyed the things they cared about most. And standing in front of her now was not the monster from her childhood. It was an old man carrying the weight of his own ruin. Then Thomas looked at her one final time and said quietly, She's waiting for you, Margaret. Margaret didn't sleep that night. Not after everything she had learned. The storm outside finally faded sometime before dawn, but the storm inside her mind only grew stronger. She sat alone in the kitchen while the old house creaked softly around her, staring at the unopened letters spread across the table. Letters her mother had written over decades. Birthday cards, Christmas notes, apologies, expressions of love. A lifetime of words Margaret was never meant to lose. Across from her sat Thomas Collins, older and quieter than the man she remembered from childhood. The anger that once defined him seemed burned away by time, leaving behind only exhaustion and regret. Margaret finally broke the silence. Where is she? Thomas looked down at his weathered hands for a long moment before answering. Monterey, California. Margaret's breath caught slightly. California. 3,000 miles away from this broken house in Maine. 3,000 miles away from 62 years of pain. She opened a small bookstore near the coast. Thomas continued softly, used a different last name all these years. Margaret stared at him carefully. And you know this because I checked on her, he admitted quietly, from time to time. The answer disgusted her more than she expected. You watched her life from a distance, she asked sharply. Thomas nodded once. But you never told me. No. Margaret stood abruptly from the table, emotion surging through her chest again. You let me bury her in my mind for 60 years. Thomas flinched slightly at the words. I thought it was safer. For who Margaret snapped? He didn't answer. Because they both already knew. For him, Margaret turned away, pressing trembling fingers against her forehead. Every emotion inside her felt tangled together. Now rage, grief, confusion, hope. Hope. That was the most dangerous part. Because after spending most of her life believing her mother abandoned her, Margaret suddenly had the terrifying possibility of seeing her again. What if she doesn't want to see me? She whispered. Thomas looked at her carefully. She never stopped wanting to. The words hit Margaret harder than anything else that night. She closed her eyes briefly, trying to steady herself. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of fear, she felt clarity. For the first time in decades, her life no longer felt frozen in the past. The truth had changed everything. And somehow, even at 74 years old, a future still existed. The next morning, Margaret drove into town before sunrise. Blackwater Cove looked different now. The narrow streets she once associated with childhood loneliness suddenly felt smaller somehow, less powerful, as if the truth had stripped the town of its hold over her memories. She stopped outside a tiny diner overlooking the harbor and ordered coffee. The waitress, a woman around Margaret's age named Ruth, smiled warmly as she refilled the cup. You visiting family? Ruth asked casually. Margaret hesitated. Then, for the first time in her life, she answered honestly. I think I might be. The words stayed with her long after she left. By noon, Margaret sat inside a small travel agency 2 towns over, staring at flight options on a computer screen. Boston to San Francisco. San Francisco to Monterey. Departure tomorrow morning. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. 1 click. That was all it would take. 1 decision to change the rest of her life. The younger version of Margaret would have found reasons not to go. Too risky, too painful, too late. But the woman sitting here now was no longer ruled by fear. Not after surviving this much loss. Not after discovering how much of her life had been stolen by silence. The travel agent smiled politely. Would you like me to book it? Margaret looked at the screen 1 final time, then nodded. Yes. The moment the ticket printed, something shifted deep inside her chest. Not closure. Movement. Forward. For the first time in decades, Margaret Collins wasn't living inside old memories anymore. She was walking toward something unknown. Toward possibility. Toward the mother she thought she lost forever. That evening, she returned to the old house one last time before leaving. Thomas sat quietly on the porch overlooking the ocean, wrapped in a heavy blanket against the cold sea wind. Margaret stopped beside him. I bought the ticket, she said. He nodded slowly, almost relieved. She'll be happy. Margaret looked out toward the dark waves crashing below the cliffs. I don't know what happens after this. Neither do I, Thomas admitted. Silence settled between them. Not comfortable, but honest. Finally, Margaret turned toward him. You don't get forgiveness just because you told the truth. Thomas lowered his eyes. I know, but, she continued quietly, at least now I know who ruined our family. He closed his eyes painfully. Margaret let the words hang there for a moment, then added softly, It wasn't just you. Thomas looked up, surprised. Margaret stared out toward the ocean again. It was fear, she whispered. Fear had shaped all of them, controlled all of them, destroyed decades they could never recover. But not anymore. The wind moved gently through the trees surrounding the old house as Margaret stepped back toward the front door. Tomorrow, she would leave Maine. Tomorrow, she would finally stop living as the abandoned little girl waiting at the window for a mother who never came home. Tomorrow, she would become someone entirely new. California felt unreal. The air was warmer than Maine, softer somehow, carrying the scent of salt and eucalyptus instead of storms and cold Atlantic wind. As Margaret stepped out of the taxi in downtown Monterey, her hands tightened around the strap of her purse. Across the street stood a small bookstore with a faded wooden sign above the windows. Sea Glass Books. The curtains fluttered gently inside the shop. Lights glowed warmly through the glass. And somewhere beyond that door, her mother was alive. Margaret's heartbeat pounded so hard she thought she might collapse right there on the sidewalk. For 62 years, she had imagined this moment 1,000 different ways. Anger, accusations, questions. But now that she was finally here, she felt like a frightened child again. The taxi driver glanced back at her kindly. You okay, ma'am? Margaret swallowed hard. No, she admitted softly. Then she opened the car door. Every step toward the bookstore felt impossibly heavy. The small bell above the entrance chimed gently as she pushed the door open. The scent inside stopped her immediately. Old paper, coffee, lavender. The exact same perfume her mother used to wear. Margaret's eyes filled instantly. Bookshelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with worn novels, history books, and faded poetry collections. Soft jazz played quietly somewhere in the background. Then, a woman emerged slowly from behind one of the shelves. Silver hair, thin frame, blue eyes Margaret had seen every morning in her own mirror for decades. Time seemed to stop. The woman froze completely. The book slipped from her hands and hit the floor with a dull thud. Margaret, she whispered. The sound of her name and her mother's voice shattered something deep inside her. For a moment, neither of them moved. 62 years of grief stood silently between them. Then Evelyn Collins covered her mouth with trembling hands as tears filled her eyes. Oh my God! Margaret wanted to speak. She wanted to ask why wanted to scream, wanted to collapse into her mother's arms. But no words came, because suddenly she understood something painful. No explanation could return the years they lost. Evelyn stepped forward slowly, almost afraid Margaret might disappear if she moved too quickly. "I never stopped loving you," she whispered. Margaret's composure broke instantly. Tears spilled down her face as decades of pain crashed through her chest all at once. "You left me," she choked out. Evelyn nodded weakly, tears falling freely now. "I know." The honesty in those words hurt more than excuses would have. "I waited for you," Margaret whispered, "for years." Evelyn's face crumpled completely. "I wanted to come back every single day." "Then why didn't you?" The question came out sharper than Margaret intended. But after 62 years, it deserved an answer. Evelyn looked down briefly before speaking. "Because the men your father worked for were still watching," she said quietly. "The federal agents told me if I contacted you, they might find you too." Margaret stared at her silently. "I thought staying away would keep you safe," Evelyn continued. "But every birthday, every Christmas, I hated myself for it." The pain in her voice felt real, not rehearsed, not defensive, just broken. And for the first time in her life, Margaret saw her mother not as a mystery, but as a frightened young woman who had made an impossible choice. Neither of them noticed the crying customer quietly slip out the front door. Hours passed inside that little bookstore. They talked, really talked, about everything. Margaret learned how Evelyn spent years moving from city to city under government protection, how she changed names repeatedly, how she opened the bookstore after finally believing the danger had passed, and Evelyn learned about the life she missed. Margaret's marriage, her teaching career, the husband she buried, the grandchildren she never had. At one point, Evelyn touched Margaret's hand carefully and whispered, "You became exactly the woman I hoped you would." Margaret looked down quietly. For most of her life, she never believed she was strong. She believed she was abandoned, forgotten, unwanted. But sitting here now, across from the woman who sacrificed everything to keep her alive, Margaret finally understood the truth. She had survived because someone loved her enough to lose her. That realization changed her. Not instantly, not perfectly, but deeply. The next morning, Margaret returned to the bookstore before sunrise carrying 2 cups of coffee. Evelyn looked surprised when she walked in. "You came back?" she whispered softly. Margaret smiled faintly. "I think I'm done running from ghosts." Evelyn laughed through tears. And for the first time since arriving in California, Margaret laughed too. Not the polite laugh she used with strangers. Not the forced laugh she learned after her husband died. A real one. Warm, alive, free. As sunlight slowly filled the bookstore windows, Margaret realized something extraordinary. At 74 years old, her life was not ending. It was finally beginning. 6 months later, Sea Glass Books had become more than just a bookstore. It had become home. Every morning. Margaret unlocked the front door at exactly 8 o'clock while Evelyn arranged fresh flowers beside the front window. Locals stopped by for coffee, tourists wandered through the narrow aisles searching for rare novels, and children curled up in the reading corner Margaret had built near the fireplace. The bookstore was alive now. Just like them. Some days were still difficult. There were moments when Margaret would suddenly remember birthdays her mother missed, school graduations, holidays spent crying quietly in her bedroom after pretending she no longer cared. Pain like that didn't disappear overnight. But something important had changed. The pain no longer controlled her. One quiet afternoon, Margaret stood on a ladder organizing books while Evelyn worked behind the counter, helping an elderly customer find a poetry collection. Margaret paused for a moment and simply watched her. The small smile, the softness in her voice, the familiar way she tucked loose silver hair behind her ear. So much time lost. And yet somehow, not too late. "You keep staring at me like that," Evelyn called gently without looking up. "And people are going to think I'm stealing books." Margaret laughed. A real laugh. The kind that once felt impossible. "I'm still getting used to you being here," she admitted. Evelyn's expression softened immediately. I still wake up afraid this is a dream. Margaret climbed down from the ladder slowly. It's not, she said quietly. And for the first time in decades, she truly believed it. Outside, the ocean breeze carried the distant sound of seagulls through the open windows. Sunlight spilled across the wooden floors, warming the bookstore in soft golden light. Peace. Not perfect peace, not the kind without scars, but the kind people earn after surviving sorrow. A few weeks later, Margaret received a letter from Maine. Thomas Collins had died quietly in his sleep. The news sat heavily in her chest, though not in the way she expected. She didn't cry. She didn't feel relief either. Only sadness for a man who spent most of his life trapped inside fear, guilt, and silence. Evelyn found Margaret sitting alone on the back porch that evening, staring at the ocean. "You heard?" Evelyn asked softly. Margaret nodded. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Then Evelyn sat beside her. "I hated him for many years," she admitted quietly. "But eventually, I realized hatred keeps you tied to the pain." Margaret looked down at her hands. "I don't know if I forgive him." "You don't have to," Evelyn replied gently. "Sometimes peace comes before forgiveness." The words settled deep inside Margaret's heart. Peace before forgiveness. For most of her life, Margaret thought healing meant undoing the past. Now she understood something different. Healing meant accepting that the past could never change while refusing to let it destroy the future. That realization transformed her completely. Over the following months, Margaret began hosting weekly gatherings inside the bookstore for older women living alone in Monterey. Some were widows, some had been abandoned by family, others simply carried quiet loneliness no one else noticed. They drank tea, shared stories, cried sometimes, and slowly, Sea Glass Books became something unexpected, a refuge. One rainy Thursday evening, a woman in her 70s approached Margaret after one of the gatherings ended. "I almost didn't come tonight," the woman admitted nervously. "I haven't spoken to anyone in weeks." Margaret smiled warmly. "I understand that feeling." The woman hesitated before asking softly, "How did you start over at this age?" Margaret looked around the bookstore, the laughter, the warmth, the life she never imagined possible at 74 years old. Then she answered honestly, "I stopped believing my best years were behind me." The woman's eyes filled with tears. And in that moment, Margaret realized something extraordinary. The greatest thing hidden beneath those floorboards was never the money. It was the truth. The truth that one painful secret had stolen decades from her life. But it had not destroyed her ability to begin again. Late one evening, after closing the bookstore, Margaret and Evelyn stood together outside watching the Pacific Ocean shimmer beneath the moonlight. "You ever regret coming back to that house in Maine?" Evelyn asked softly. Margaret thought about the stormy night, the suitcase, the lies, the grief. Then she smiled gently. "No," she said, "because if I hadn't gone back, I never would have found my way here." Evelyn slipped her hand into Margaret's, and together, beneath the quiet California sky, two women who had lost most of their lives to fear finally understood something beautiful. It is never too late to uncover the truth, to rebuild what was broken, or to become the person you were always meant to be. Margaret spent most of her life believing her mother abandoned her. But hidden beneath the floorboards was the truth her mother left to protect her from a dangerous man and never stopped loving her. After decades of pain and misunderstanding, Margaret finally learned that people often make terrible choices out of fear, not lack of love. At 74 years old, she discovered it was not too late to heal, forgive, and begin again. Sometimes the truth hurts, but sometimes it also sets you free. Many people carry emotional wounds for years without knowing the full story behind them. This story reminds us to stop assuming, ask questions, let go of old bitterness, believe that healing is possible at any age. A new beginning can happen even after a lifetime of pain. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. And remember, it's never too late to rebuild your life and find peace again.